Hello my dear friends, you're on the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 29th of July of 2024. Today we have a lot of very interesting updates, so let's start. And first we're going to talk about Pokrovsk direction. As you can see, we have adjusted the map because during the previous day we received significant number of details and updates about the current status of the village of Vovcha and about the small cauldron between Progress and Lazavatsk itself. First, let's talk about Vovcha. The Russian sources published the video on how they managed to secure the village completely, and in the final part of the video we can see how the Russian soldiers managed to raise the flag in the most southern part of the village. For example, in this episode we might see just the movements of the Russian soldiers. This is the first Russian flag that was raised in the most southern part of the village of Vovcha, and in the second flag in the final part of the video is the flag that was established in the central part. Based on this video, we have adjusted the map and colored the territory under complete Russian control. Furthermore, according to the report of the Minister of Defense of Russian Federation, the Russians confirmed full control over the city as well. Now let's move to the west. We have the video. This is the video that was published by pro-Ukrainian sources, more precisely by the soldiers of 151st Mechanized Brigade. In this video we can see a series of FPV drone strikes on Russian positions that took place to the west of Vovcha and in the vicinity of Lazavatsk and Vozdvizhenka. So let's return back on map. The first FPV drone strikes took place along this tree line, which confirms complete control over this area, and in the final part of that video we might see how the Ukrainian FPV drones were attacking the Russian soldiers in this tree line in this small forest. Based on these two episodes we have adjusted the map, and also based on the Minister of Defense report and the Russian flags inside of Vovcha, we have adjusted the map and added significant territories under complete Russian control. These two, let's say, areas used to be in the gray zone or in the area of is in contested area. Now let's move further. We have additional updates from the village of Vysole. During the previous few days we were talking that the Russians were trying to improve their positions around Vysole in the eastern and the southeastern let's say positions. Furthermore, we got updates that the Russians managed to improve their positions in this southern and the southern western part of the village, and during the previous 24 hours, according to different mappers including pro-Ukraine mappers, the Russians launched assault operation inside of Vysole village itself, and the Russians forced the Ukrainians who were inside of the village to fall back towards the 0544 road. Most likely during the next day or the next few days the Russians will clear the village and secure the village completely, and then the Ukrainians will be forced to fall back towards the city of Grodovka. And as for the next cities and the next towns in this area, by taking under control the villages like Ivanovka, like Vysole, like Zhelanne, like Sergeyevka, the Russians will basically take under control the last small villages. After these villages we start seeing different more or less big towns like Grodovka, like Novogrodovka, like Mirnograd itself, and Pokrovsk. So there are not so many towns left between Pokrovsk itself and edge Russian positions, and as you can see the Russians are moving. Also, let's talk about Zhelanne. During the previous few days we were talking a lot about additional Russian progress that they managed to achieve by moving along the railways, and this is the first day. The 29th of July is the first day when we haven't received even a single update, even a small update about further Russian progress along the same railway. So which confirms that the Russians stopped. They stopped not because the Ukrainians managed to force them to stop. The Russians just decided not to move further, because to move further, first of all, they need to maintain the flanks. And as for the northern flank, the Russians is about to establish complete control over Vysole, but as for the southern flank, there are still a lot of things to do. According to information we have, the Russians began moving towards Zhelanne along the tree lines, as we discussed in the previous, as we were projecting during the previous videos. So the Russians improved their position positions, and this information, this progress was confirmed by different mappers, including pro-Ukrainian and let's say neutral mappers. So let's wait for additional updates, and most likely by tomorrow the Russians will be able to reach this tree line, and then the main battle, the main phase of the battle for Zhelanne is going to start. Now let's talk about Novoselivka Persha. The Russian sources published another video, very interesting video. In this scenes we can see how the Russians were attacking Novoselivka Persha itself. Most of the building was destroyed and reduced to ruins, and in the final part of the video we can see how the Russians were raising another Russian flag in the most northwestern part of this small village. This is very important because the Russians reported that they managed to capture this small village a long time ago, maybe a week or a few days ago, or maybe a week ago, but not just now the Russian sources published the video with the flag from the most northwestern part. Very interesting. Maybe the Russians published archived let's say scenes, or maybe just during the previous few days the Russians managed to reach this part. And even though the Russians anyway are moving towards the next defense belt to this stronghold, but to attack the stronghold first the Russians need to improve their positions along this tree line. Only this way the Russians will be able to move further in the western direction along 0542 road without any resistance from the Ukrainian side. Now let's move further. Let's talk about Krasnohorivka. During the previous 24 hours, we received significant number of updates and updates from this territory. First of all, according to pro-Ukrainian mappers, by the beginning of the 29th of July, the Ukrainians abandoned their positions inside of the main part of Krasnohorivka, of the citadel. And starting of the 29th of July, there were no more Ukrainians to the south of Lazova River and to the east of Sidova and Yabluneva streets. So this territory either was under complete Russian control or in the gray zone. But by the time we start making the video, the neutral mappers adjusted their maps as well and added additional control by the Russian forces. The Russians, first of all, according to different pro-neutral mappers, captured the central part of Krasnohorivka itself completely. And the most important, the Russians, as a result of offensive operation, managed to cross Lazova Street and to enter the buildings and to enter the first buildings and constructions along Schmitta Street. So this is very important advance of armed forces of Russian Federation. I didn't expect that the Russians are able so fast to cross Lazova River. I suppose that Ukrainians will be able to show at least some resistance along this blue line, but according to the latest update provided by neutral mappers, the Ukrainians show no resistance. The Russians crossed the river, and now there is a very big risk for the Ukrainians to be encircled by the Russians if the Russians are going to move further along this red line. If the Russians are able to cut Kobzorya Street and Schmitta Street in two, then the Ukrainians who are currently located between these fields might be encircled or might be forced to fall back, because in this case, if the Russians are able to move further in the northern direction, the Ukrainians who are currently located in these trenches will have just one way for evacuation, and they will be forced to move as close as possible to the village of Novoselivka. So in this case, if the Russians are able to improve a little bit to the west, then the Russians will be able to capture the Ukrainians who are currently located in these fields. I will add this polygon on map. So currently there are very high risk for the Ukrainians of being encircled, for those Ukrainians who are currently located in this small artillery pocket. Now let's move further in the southwestern part of Krasnohorivka. During the previous days we made lots of changes on the map exactly in this part of Krasnohorivka of the city, and today, according to different mappers, the Ukrainians fell back from this area and the Russians restored complete control over Lermontova and Железнодорожная Street. For now we haven't received any geolocations that can confirm this. The only thing we have is the video how the Ukrainians were under very heavy fire between these streets few days ago, but we haven't received anything that confirms that the Russians restore control over this territory. Now let's move further. Let's talk about southern Donetsk direction. The Russians continue effective counter-artillery duels. During the previous 24 hours, the Russians published another batch of videos of how they were hunting and destroying Ukrainian howitzers that were located between Kurakhova, Maximilianovka, Konstantinovka, Ivanovka, Uspenovka in this small pocket. Another batch of artillery systems were destroyed by the Russians, but the most important is the number of artillery systems that the Ukrainians have already lost for the previous months, because somewhere a month ago during June we were talking a lot about the numbers of updates and about the real casualties of Ukrainian forces in this direction. So let's do this once again in July, and if we increase the numbers of updates since the beginning of July, we're gonna see tens of armored vehicles, artillery systems that were destroyed by the Russians, and these just the videos that were geolocated. Obviously the number of artillery systems that were destroyed by the Russians during counter-artillery duels is much bigger. Now let's talk about additional updates from Pokrovsk and the western Donetsk direction. Today, during the previous 24 hours, we have additional video how the Ukrainians were trying to redeploy the HIMARS artillery system. The Ukrainians, as you can see, try to slow down the Russians as they can. They're trying to use everything they have, including HIMARS systems, and the Ukrainians try to get the fire positions, but the Russians managed to discover first the movements of this system and then the parking place of this multiple launch rocket system, and then the Russians destroyed this area, attacked this area with Iskander. Now let's talk about Konstantinovka direction, Vuhledar area. The Ukrainians try to slow down the Russians as they can. During the previous 24 hours, they've shown a lot of videos of how they were FPV droning the Russians, abandoned Russian tanks, armored vehicles that, as I understand, currently have no problems to move from TO524 road and the village of Solotka. Few more tanks, few more armored vehicles, personnel carriers were attacked by the Ukrainian FPV drones, which confirms that the Russians are concentrating more and more forces exactly in this area between Vadiana and the coal mine. So most likely after a few days of clashes, obviously we're going to receive additional updates in Russian favor. We have received additional video of Russian progress along Balka Saloninka. In this video we can see a small Russian group of 3 soldiers that were attacking the Ukrainian positions in this area, and based on this video most of the mappers have adjusted their maps. The Russians captured additional stronghold and got as close as possible to the road TO524. This information was also confirmed by different mappers. Now let's move to Toretsk, New York agglomeration. During the previous 24 hours we haven't received anything from New York, but we got a lot of updates from Pivnichne, Pivdinne and Zalizne. According to different mappers, the Russians, as a result of offensive operation, managed to significantly improve their positions in the village of Zalizne and in the city of Pivnichne. Currently, the Russians control the territory along the Pioneer Avenue for around 2 kilometers. Obviously, this is significant distance that is under complete Russian control, at least fire, maybe in some places physical control. And as I understand, now the Russians are focused to concentrate as many as possible units, as many as possible soldiers exactly along this street, Pioneer Avenue. And as soon as the Russians are able to do this, they will try to cross the Pioneer Avenue, they will try to capture Toretsk College and to move further deep inside of Ukrainian defense belt in direction of Toretsk itself. This will allow the Russians to split this territory into many pieces and then to handle with every single one separately, slowly and step by step. So once again, as we can see, the situation for the Ukrainians is getting very difficult, and the Ukrainians still haven't managed to stabilize the line of combat contact. Now let's talk about Chasiv Yar. We have additional updates. The Ukrainians have redeployed the forces of AT's brigade in this direction with the purpose to stabilize the situation. This brigade is a very experienced brigade that was involved in the battle for Klishchiivka and Kharkiv counter-offensive operation. So this brigade has more or less reliable story of military path, and this brigade was redeployed to Chasiv Yar, and the Ukrainian commanders ordered this brigade to begin counter-offensive with the purpose to counterattack the Russians and to restore complete control over Siversk Donetsk-Donbass canal. So the Ukrainian commanders of this brigade realized that this order was something like another episode of suicide operation that Ukrainian commanders wants to conduct, and the soldiers and the commanders of 80th Air Assault Brigade refused to follow the order, and this situation led to arrest of the general of the commander colonel of 80th Air Assault Brigade, and during the previous 24 hours the 80th Brigade published 2 videos demanding the Ukrainian military authorities to release their commander and to return him back to this brigade. So this is probably the first more or less organized, more or less centralized, not like strike, it's a protest in the Ukrainian army that was conducted by 80th Brigade, not by the commanders, not by the officers, but by the entire brigade. The video that was published has a lot of episodes of different soldiers who were demanding the Ukrainian military authorities to return back their commander, their colonel of 80th Air Assault Brigade. Anyway, this is from the first side, but from another side we see, and during the previous 24 hours we got report that the Russians managed to cross Siversk Donetsk-Donbass river. The Russians managed to do this. Basically, the Russians managed to defeat the Ukrainians along canal and to force them to fall back. And the Russians, according to information we have, were crossing the canal somewhere in this direction, and then they were moving in the southeastern direction towards the micro district Novi. And maybe this is the reason why the soldiers of 80th Air Assault Brigade published the video demanding their officers, the generals, to return back their commander, because they understand that most likely they are the brigade. 80th Brigade is the brigade that would be sent to the central Chasiv Yar to stabilize the situation. They understand that most likely this is going to be a suicide operation. Most likely they will lose up to 70 or 80% of the current number of personnel and soldiers inside of this brigade, and basically in 2-3 weeks or in 4 weeks of clashes they will lose their combat capabilities. And basically they just refused all these things and decided to be arrested, because in this case to be arrested is much more better than to be sent to fight with the Russians. So this is the situation, and most likely the central part of Chasiv Yar will fall very, very soon. The Russian sources published additional videos of how they were hunting and attacking the Ukrainian forces in the central part of the city, trying to destroy their ammo depots, warehouses, their positions, and so on. Now let's move to Kupiansk area. We have additional updates, and the most important are coming from the north in Kupiansk direction. During the previous 24 hours, the Russians published the video how they managed to discover the ammo depot of armored forces of Ukraine as a result of reconnaissance operation, and as a result of aviation strike, a very big ammo depot was destroyed with significant number of munition. As for the situation on the ground, the Russians are saying that after they managed to improve their positions to the north of Peshane, the Russians decided to change their focus, and the Russian army began moving in the southern direction from Peshane towards the road between Berestova and the city of Kruglakovka. So this is exactly what is happening right now. The Russians are moving from Peshane to the south, and the main goal and the main purpose of the Russians is to establish complete control over this part. And if the Russians are able to do this, then we understand that Ukrainians in Stelmakhovka and the Ukrainians who have their positions between these fields will start facing significant problems in logistics, and not just about problems with logistics. From this perspective, there are very high risk of being encircled by the Russians and to get into another cauldron. Now let's move to Vovchansk. After a very long operational pause, both the Ukrainians and the Russians resumed their attempts to attack each other. The Russians began bombing the eastern part of the northern Chasiv Yar. In this video we can see the arrivals of 3 FAP 105,000 or 3,000, or maybe the Russians were using FAPs with lower calibers, but they managed managed to get and to destroy the Ukraine ammo depots in this part. Anyway, the explosions, as you can see, are very big, are very heavy, and most likely the Russians will begin offensive in this direction with the purpose to cut the Ukrainian foothold in the northern part. Also, we got reports that the Russians resumed their attempts to attack the citadel of Vovchansk. During the previous 24 hours, they conducted significant number of artillery strikes, of test-flame tower strikes. As for changes on the ground, no changes, but maybe soon we're gonna see some. And as for the village of Tikha, the same story. The Russians resumed their attempts to bomb the village with significant number of aviation and FABs and different types of weapon. So something big is about to start, and most likely this something big will be conducted by the Russian forces. Now let's talk about northern Kharkiv direction. During the previous 24 hours, according to the report of the group of forces north, they attacked the temporary position of armored forces of Ukraine with FAB 3000, and as a result of strike, the Ukrainians lost up to 50 soldiers. Most likely the official sources of group of forces north were talking about this building. As you can see, as a result of FAB 3000, the entire building was almost reduced to ruins. Let's take a look at the video once again. This is the building. This is very strong building, not something like wooden or something like this. And we see the arrival of FAB 3000. Most likely it was something like ammo depot, because the explosion was very heavy, was very big. Most likely there was some ammo depot or some explosive inside of the basements or something like this. As for Kharkiv itself, the Russians during the previous 24 hours discovered the positions of Ukrainian raiders, and as a result of Iskander strikes, the raider was destroyed. As we can see, the Ukrainians can't show any resistance, no air defense at all. The Russians are able to do whatever they like. Yes, the Ukrainians began bombing and attacking the Russian positions. They tried to destroy the Russian airfields deep inside of the territory of Russian Federation, but as for 29th of July, the Ukrainians haven't managed to achieve more or less good results as a result of these actions. Also, Zelensky began talking more and more about this peace summit, and according to him, the next peace summit is going to take place in the late November if Zelensky is able to hold power until these days. And as I understand, Zelensky is waiting for the final days for the end of elections in the United States of America, and then he will be able to understand which plan he should use, either Joe Biden's or the plan of Donald Trump, because they're a little bit different to each other, and completely different consequences for Ukraine can be implemented as a result of this or that plan. And that's it for today. Military Summary channel reminds we condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day.